Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Okay, so we have finished the part for convolutional neural network. Okay, and we will come back for ConvNets again after we have finished this recurrent neural network. So yeah, so ConvNets will be more useful than simply doing the classification, image classification model or object detection applications. And in the chapter for generative adversarial network or GANs, we will look at how ConvNets can be used to train amazing models that can generate realistic images from scratch, from basic random inputs. So that's something we will revisit again. Okay. So before that, we will start this new topic on recurrent neural network. So this new type of model that we're gonna look into is suitable for a pretty different task that compared to the image classification task that we are familiar with so far. So in this chapter, the neural network models are particularly useful for modeling sequential inputs or sequential data. So the inputs we're dealing with is no longer like pixels in a matrix or in a volume, but now it's rather sequence inputs, right? So this sequence can be of various types. It goes beyond the language, beyond the voice input, voice data. It could be the a segments in the DNA sequence, right? So basically any kind of sequence data that has temporal patterns can be a good candidate for using such models, such recurrent neural network-based models. Okay. All right. So let's let's look at the content again. So what we're gonna do is basically two steps. We will focus on the simple recurrent neural network structure. We're gonna go dive into the details of how this simple recurrent structure deals with sequential inputs. Okay, what is the forward pass and backward pass mechanisms? And we will look at a particular example of using RNNs for language modeling task. And then we will look at the gated recurrent units, the RNNs with gated units, with focus on two classical examples, the GRU and the LSTMs. Okay, so that is basically the structure for this chapter. All right, let's look at more context, more examples. So the sequence data that or the sequence modeling tasks that we're talking about now actually span across a very broad range. Like in speech recognition, we can use the raw audio inputs, which is in sequential formats, and the model should take that input and convert it into some, first convert it into a human readable language, right? And based on which the meanings can be extracted, right? So the inputs, the conversion from one type of sequential input to another type of sequential outputs is one of the typical tasks the RNN models are dealing with. A second example I put here is sentiment analysis. Like you can, given a short text-based comments, there's meanings conveyed in it, and the sentiment is just one dimension of evaluating the meaning in your in that input. Like you can give a score 1 out of 10 to indicate whether the comment is relatively positive versus negative, right? And a more advanced example task is translation. Like this X from the mapping from X to Y is a simplified a simplification of this rather sophisticated process. So we need to extract meanings from one sequence and use that meaning represented by some hidden activations in the model, and then use that as the basis for the next step of generation. Okay, so the Y here, right here, is another sequence. So the third example actually is pretty similar to the first example in some sense, because they are all conversion from one sequence, from the input sequence to the output sequence. Okay, the difference is that the first is only on the sequence on the input side, right? So that's the third example, and the fourth example is the one that I'm gonna we're gonna focus on here, because we will use that as an example later. It's a specific task in natural language processing, which is called named entity recognition. So a named entity includes like the person's name, place's name, that can be represented by some entity, right? So in the sentence, SDSU plan for Mission Valley campus advanced in San Diego's economic growth. So how do we recognize that SDSU here represents a university, right? It's an organization's name. And the Mission Valley is a place name, right? A location, right? San Diego is a city's name. So in order to develop models that understand human language, then to recognize those entities in the language formed by words are one of the most important tasks. Okay, so this task is basically a labeling task, right? So if we want to go through this with the simplistic description, it will be like we go through those letters one by one, right? And whenever we reach a point that the model thinks there is an entity recognized, then it should paint the part being recognized to give it a label, right? Like the output did. All the entities will be given a label. Okay. So that is a example from the NLP perspective. All right. So it actually goes, the idea of modeling sequence data actually goes beyond language. It also goes into computer vision, like our daily activities, like the way I move my hands, the way that I change my hand gestures, the way that I change my body pose, right? So these informations, sequential informations, they actually encode meanings, right? When I was doing a particular task like pouring water into this cup, it's can be decomposed into temporal temporal frames or temporal inputs, which are kind of similar to a language, right? It's a step-by-step process. So the video that records human activities can actually be modeled, use the similar sequential models, right? So that the different types of activities can be automatically recognized, right? And lastly, the last example I put here is a typical bioinformatics example that's given the human genes data. How do we recognize all the patterns in our DNAs, which will be the basis for different tasks, different analysis tasks, like the correlation between certain types of diseases, right? So yeah, that is a brief introduction to possible applications that sequential models can be applied to. Okay. So now let's use the NLP task named entity recognition to define some notations that will be used across this chapter. So here we first use the X to indicate the input. Okay. So in this case, the X is a a sequence of letters, right? A sequence of words, okay? And let's say we have that sequence of inputs, and our output would be will be a sequence of binary numbers. It could be a sequence of either 0 or 1. And in this case, the output is 1 0 1 0, and the 1 indicates that this is a positive label, which means we have an entity recognized, right? Because Gandalf is a person's name, so that's why we give it a 1. But the second word told is not a person's name, so in this task we give it a 0 output, and again positive for the name Frodo, right? So, and we assume that for this task, the first inputs, the inputs at the first time step is called x1, 1 in superscripts, and between this sharp parentheses, okay? So it's a different notation than the way that we used to do to the superscript. What we used to do is to put x round parentheses 1, right? That will indicate a one input feature, right? But this is not the case. We put it into this sharp parenthesis, indicates that this is the one here is not the first instance, but it's for the first time step. Okay, so the one here, the meaning of the 1 is for the first time step. Okay, the inputs consist of several time steps. All right, so that is the input, which refers to the word Gandalf. That will be the first input. And the second and the third will be x2, x3, right, accordingly, right, until we reach the end of the sentence. And the last word, ring, will be the input at the 9th step. Okay, so far no problem, right? So it's a very straightforward way to organize the inputs into different time steps, right? So in general, we use the letter T put into this sharp parenthesis to indicate the inputs at the T's time step. And sometimes we can use the capital T of X to indicate the total number of inputs for one particular example. Okay, so for one example, X, the time steps is 9. Okay, and for the outputs, we will also have 9 time steps. Okay, so this time the Y is also a sequence. Okay, it is not just a one variable, but it is 9 labels, 9 labels for the 9 inputs time step correspondingly, right? So the general notation we will use is to use now, we can put 2 superscripts into X, because the I within the round parenthesis is our convention to indicate the I's training example, right? But now, since in our task, we will take one sequence as one training example. So the I in the superscripts now means it is the I's sequence, right? But we will need a second superscript T to indicate which time step it is within that I's sequence, right? And meanwhile, the capital T for the I's training sequence means the length for that sequence, right? And similarly for Y. Okay. So it's still a supervised learning problem. So for this named entity recognition task, we are still trying to learn the mapping relationship between X and Y, right? The only difference is that now X and Y, both in X and Y are sequences. Okay. All right. Let's further dive into the practical problem of how we can represent a word, right? So this is a typical natural language processing problem, but don't worry, you don't think of so this is not a narrow problem, right? So although it's a specific example, because the way that we gonna use to represent the word actually is nowadays a pretty broad method, and I think it's a good example of showing how recurrent neural network can handle sequential inputs. Okay. So given the notations so far, we have this example x and with 9 time steps, right, from x1 to x9. So what we're gonna do to represent the inputs at each time step is to use the so-called one-hot encoding. And the one-hot encoding is a commonly used technique. And in language data particularly, we need to utilize the vocabulary. Okay, and a vocabulary refers to the set of all unique words, all the unique words in the data. For example, if we list all the unique words, all the words that have appeared in the training data from the first word, right? That is a very common word in English. From to about, all, until the last word appeared in our data, which is zoo. Okay, and we in this example we just sort all the words by the alphabetic order. Okay, so this set of all the words that have appeared in our training data is something we call the vocabulary. Assume that we have 10,000 unique words in this vocabulary. Then that means our vocabulary size is 10K. Okay, so this will be the basis for us to construct the so-called one-hot encoding for each word. Okay, so given this vocabulary, we can assign each word in it with a number to indicate as the index for that word. Okay, so let's give 1 to the first word A. Okay, and 10,000 to the last word zoo. So these numbers will be the index for that word, and each word will get a unique index. And assume that the word Frodo is indexed 2,305 and the Gandalf is indexed with 4,012. So mark these two indices and we will use it. We will use them for the next step. So Gandalf can be represented by a very long vector with 0 and 1s. And the special place is that there is only one 1 in that long vector. And that 1 is at the position of the 4,012 elements in that long vector. And the length of the vector is 10,000. Okay, so that means there's only that 1 at this position, and all the other elements are 0. All the other 9,999 elements are 0. Okay, so that's where the name comes from, one-hot. So there's only one place that is a non-zero values, and all the others are zeros. Okay, and the length of it is 10,000. And similarly, we do that for the word toad. Okay, toad will also be given, will be represented by this long vector with all zeros except for the position where it is the 7,677th place, because the ID, the index for the word toad is that number according to the way we construct our vocabulary, right? So we do that for all the words, Frodo, right? So all these very long, narrow vectors, right? We call them one-hot vectors. These will be the inputs for the RNN model that we're gonna build. Okay. All right. Let's look at the problem at the next step. Right. So what we're gonna do is to build a model. Right. We want to learn the mapping relationship between X and Y. Okay. So before we apply the RNN models, what we're gonna do, so our we can, like, a straightforward thinking is that what about we just use a regular neural network without using the so-called recurrent neural network mechanism, right? For example, we know that the first word, the first input vector is 10K, right? It has 10K elements in it. The second one is also 10K, right? So assume that we have, assume that we have 10 words in total, and that's 10 words concatenated together will be 10 by 10,000 long, very long input vector, right? And if we use that as the inputs for a regular neural network, we can see a very straightforward problem, right? Because the parameters, the weight matrix will be super big, right? We want to take all the inputs, the input at different time steps, and we want to concatenate them. Then our inputs, total input would be very long, okay? And it's not flexible because maybe for one sentence we have 10 words in it, and then the next sentence would be 12 words in it. Then we have to change the model, right? So the model is not flexible at all, okay? And the second point that I listed here is that the different positions are not, so the features at different time steps are not shared. It's like the information we use to predict the second outputs is not basically shared with the one that we use to predict the first time step. Okay. So that is problematic because language is incremental. Okay. The difficulty of predicting my last word will be very different from the task of predicting my first word, right? So let's think of this as a game, right? So if you're gonna guess what I'm gonna say in the next word, so it is really hard, right? Because you don't know what is my intention unless you know my intention well, unless you have heard enough, right? And unless you have the context information about the conversation, right? If you know this is a machine learning class, if you know that we're going to talk about RNN today, then the chance that you predict the next word will be much higher, right? So language is sequential. Language is incremental. Language depends on context. So that is a tricky part of handling the sequential data. So the regular neural network it doesn't provide such a mechanism of using the previous time step to predict the next time step. So not to mention the huge model issue, right? If we're gonna use that many parameters, that will be a problem. Okay. So we will look at the recurrent neural network structure. So a recurrent neural network structure looks like this. First of all, we still need to take care of the inputs for each time step, right? The first time step is the first word, x1. We will feed that inputs into some neural network model, and the model will generate some prediction, which is the y hat one. Okay, we give it a hat, call it y hat because it is a prediction, and then we give it a superscript 1 because this is the prediction for the first time step, right? And for the second time step, we will feed the second word into the model, and the model will also generate some the prediction for the second time step, which is y hat 2, right? And the difference from a regular neural network is that, okay, in the prediction of the second output, for the second input, we will take the inputs, we will take the activation from the previous time step as the input for the current time step. Okay, so because in the previous time step, in time step 1, when x1 is taken as inputs, it will compute some internal hidden representations or hidden activations. Let's call it A1, because this is still this is computed in the first time step. Okay, and this A1 is carried on into the next computation, given x2 as input. Okay, so the y hat 2, how do we compute y hat 2 is a combination of the current inputs x2 and the previous activation A1. So the previous activation A1 is kind of the historical information. All right, so this two part is taken as input altogether. And we can infer for the third one, when we compute the third time step, then x3 is taken as input, while at the same time, the activations from A2 is also used as the inputs. Okay, and we carried on this computation until we reach the end of the sequence, until we reach the end of the input sequence, right? And the activation from the previous time step is reused. Okay, so a little technical detail about the first time step is that because when we first take the word A1 as input, so there's no historical information, there's no previous activation, right? So we will fake some data, we will like feed into some file vector of all zeros in A0, and that will be part of the inputs for the first time step. Okay. So because this is a neural network and the computation done at each time step is not very different from a regular neural network. So we will require a weight matrix, WAX, okay? And of course, there will be a bias, okay? So, but I didn't put it here. But this WAX is a set of matrix or weight matrix that represents how we take the inputs x1 and use that weight matrix to compute the external the activations. And there will be a second weight matrix, WAA, and this WAA, the function of WAA is to take the previous activation as input and generate some output. You see, because now the network should handle two parts of the inputs, not just from X, but also from previous A. So it makes sense to have two set of parameters, right? We have WAX to handle the inputs, the actual inputs from X, while WAA handles the previous activation, which is the historical information. And also, in order to generate some outputs Y, we will need to have a third set of parameter, which is WYA, okay? And its purpose is to generate the outputs, okay? And that is for the first time step, right? And these parameters will be used for each time step. So we will have parameters here for the second time step, for the third time step, and for the last time step as well. Okay, so you see, the thing is that these parameters are not, they are the same one as these parameters. Okay, so the group of parameters that I put into different colors, they are actually the same parameters. They are shared across different time steps. the WAX used in time step 1 is actually the same WAX used in time step 2, and the same one used in time step 3 until the last time step. And the same for the WAA and the WYA. Okay, all the parameters are shared across time step. That is the most important characteristics of recurrent neural network. Okay, so in order to represent the network with a more compact visualization, right? So we don't need to roll out all the time steps. We will simply put a one layer network like this, but we can put something as a circle here as a cycle to showcase this is a recurrent network. It will take the activation from itself as the input for the next time step, or we can like use this style to connect from one end to the other to indicate this is a recurrent neural network. All right, so that's a basic principle of the recurrent neural network, simple recurrent neural network. So for this particular time step at t equals 3, right, it's a third time step, we see that the inputs, the outputs y hat 3, okay, actually it relies not just on x3. It's not just relied on the input at time step 3, okay, because it also depends on what A2 is, right? So A2 is the part of the input, but where is A2 from? A2 is from X2 and A1, right? So which means the information from X2 and X1 are all carried on to the step of to the third time step when we compute y hats. Okay, so this is an important mechanism, and this is quite useful for modeling language tasks, right? Because we want to use the previous words to predict the next word. That is a natural, just a natural way of predicting languages, right? So we can see that this is the core mechanism that makes it successful in language predicting. Okay, so let's put this question here. We can think about whether this mechanism is sufficient. Okay, use these two examples. I have two sentences listed here. The above sentence says, he said Teddy Roosevelt was a great president, right? And the second one said, he said teddy bears are on sale. So how do we know that? So if we are reading the sentences sequentially, right, from the left to right, right, how do we know that the word teddy refers to a president's name or just to teddy bears, right? So actually, without reading the word after the word teddy, right, we will never know that this teddy actually refers to a person's name or a toy's name. Okay, so it seems that using just the information on the left or using the historical information seems not that sufficient in predicting the current word. It seems that a more comprehensive way would be to use the information from both sides, right? We need to both look to the left and the right and use the context word to predict the word in the middle. That would be the way that makes most sense, right? That most makes sense. So this is just a tip that we can keep in mind for now, because later in the next lecture, when we introduce more advanced neural network structure, we're gonna see why the directions of recurrent neural network really matters. All right, so that's the first example of neural network that we looked into. So now we will step into the forward pass and backward pass more carefully. Okay. So we have listed the inputs for time step 1, x1, the outputs, desired outputs, y hat 1, and the activation from previous time step, which is A0, and outputs for this current time step A1, and all the parameters, WAA, WAX, WYA, okay? And assume that this activation for the first time step is 0. All right, so what we're gonna do for each time step is pretty similar to a regular neural network. For example, you can use, what we're gonna do is to use the activation from the previous time step, A0, times the weight parameter, the weight matrix WAA, plus the results of WAX times X1 plus BA. Okay, so this BA is for the bias, is a bias term. Okay, and then we can use some activation layers, the activation function, which could be 10H or ReLU. Okay, that is how we compute A1. So this is the activation for the current time step. Okay, and we need to compute y hat 1 as well, right? Y hat 1 is here. So the y hat 1 is computed using a different set of parameters, which is WYA, right? WYA is here. And that, so the inputs for Y1, for this computation is A1. So A1 is just computed from the previous time step, is from the previous step here, okay? So A1 is used as inputs, and now a different bias as well. So this G2, the new activation function, it can be a sigmoid, it can be a softmax, right? Depends on what kind of output we want, right? If it's a binary prediction, it could be, we can use sigmoid. Otherwise, it could be a softmax. Okay. Right. So that's for the first time step, and the next time step, we'll use A1 as inputs, right? And the A2 will be the outputs, right? So the general principle, if we write it down, it will look like this. The activation from for the current time step will be computed using the activation from the previous time step, plus the inputs at the current time step, and some bias with some activation function. And the y hats will be based on this activation. Okay. So that is a general principle. And because sometimes we want to simplify it, basically here, at this step, we have two inputs, which is the activation from previous time step and the current inputs xt. So it's sometimes not that convenient if we set two weight matrices, WAA and WAX, right? So we can combine this into a same matrix WA, okay? And so that it's in a more compact format, okay? So we only have two weight matrices, WA and WX now. Okay, so it's some typical input sizes for the network could be like this. We can use the activation size to be 100, right? So the activations can be a 100 length vector. And each time step input, it could be longer. For example, 10,000. So remember this 10,000, it's like so correlated to the way that we construct xt, right? If we use a vocabulary of 10K to construct Onehot encodings, then this xt will be, of course, 10,000. It could be longer, even longer, or shorter. Okay, so this is not fixed. So if we have shorter vocabularies, it can be just a shorter one-hot encodings, or it could be even not. It could be other than the one-hot encodings. We can use regular vectors rather than one-hot encodings. These are all possible choices. Okay. So in this particular example, if our X is 10,000 long, 10,000 elements, and A is 100 elements in it. So altogether, our WA is the combination of these two parameters, which is 10,100 by 1. Okay, in such a dimension. Okay. So that's the forward propagation or forward pass. Okay, and here's this another notation, because in some papers or posts, people don't use the subscripts A or subscripts AA, AX, AY. So they will use the capital letters like W, V, U, but basically they are the same thing, right? They just refer to different parameters used for different positions, different steps. Okay. Then here it comes the key notation for back propagation, right? So the most difficult part to understand the neural network is the back propagation algorithm, and the special mechanism of recurrent neural network makes it even more tricky for back propagation through for the recurrent neural network. So the mechanism we will take is called back propagation through time. Okay, so this is a fancy word, but it's just a propagation that carry out further steps that goes beyond the one time step. Okay, so let's look at the example here. Because in order to back propagate, you need to first compute some loss, right? You need to have some loss. And since this is we have one output at each time step, there will be a loss computed for each time step. Okay, so y hat 1 will be compared with some ground truth at the first time step, and the loss will be computed. And this loss, for example, if it's a logistic regression loss, if it's a logistic regression task, right? So the computation would be like this typical logistic regression loss, right? It's a special form for the cross entropy loss. Okay, so we will have the gradients for y hat 1 computed, and these gradients will be back propagated through the network, right? From the y hat 1, we can compute the gradients for A1, right? And because the A1 is multiplied with WY and BY, so the WY and BY will also have gradients computed, okay? And then the gradients for DWA and DBA will also be computed because it's just like a regular network, okay? So the trickier part is the next. So if we have some loss computed for the second time step, which is computed between the loss, between the prediction y hat 2 and the ground truth of y2. The loss at the second time step will have the gradients computed for y hat 2, right? And the gradients for dA2. So what's next is a critical step, because A1 is used in computing A2. So the gradients for A2 will back propagate also to A1. It will back propagate to the previous time step, not just stay at the current time step. Okay. And similarly, for the third time step, the gradients for dA3 will also back propagate to A2. Okay. And that applies basically to all the time steps afterwards. Even if we are computing the time step for the gradients for the last step the gradients for that time step will back propagate all the way through through the computational graph to the previous time step. Okay, so this is the so-called back propagation through time, which means the gradients of the later time step will propagate to the earlier time steps. Okay, so we will have a complete workflow for a complete chart for how this back propagation through time is carried out. So before we do that, actually there's a intuitive understanding for this, right? Because each back propagation requires some computation, right? If we recall the formula for back prop in regular network, so it will be the matrix, it will be the dot product between the W and the A's, right? So the disease will be the W times dA transpose, right? And then W transpose times dA will be the so the gradients for W will be dA transpose times dZ, sort of like that, right? So there's a matrix dot product computation required for each back prop. So the problem is that if the gradients at the last step here, when it's back propped, we need to compute the gradients for all the parameters along the way, right? So that is a lot of computation, right? For the last time step, we need to back propagate all the way to the beginning. So if it's a long sequence, then it's actually a very deep network, right? There's a lot of dot product needed for each time step, okay? So it makes the computation very expensive, and also sometimes it's not that necessary. So for the last time step, it's not necessary to back prop all the arrows to the very beginning. Okay, so we'll see that a few slides later. We'll see the problem and how do we deal with this problem. So on this slide, we will show a complete example of how the back propagation through time looks like. Right, let's focus on the fourth time step and assume that this is a logistic regression task at this fourth time step, and this is how the loss is constructed, right? And since y hat is the sigmoid function applied to the outputs, let's call it O4, okay? So let's, and we know that O4 is a linear combination between the weight matrix V times A4. So here, just for simplification, we don't use the W superscripts, W subscript notation. We use the VWU, okay? But it's essentially the same, okay? So this O, you can think of it another way of saying this is a Z, okay? All right, so that's how we compute the DO, right? So recall in logistic regression, DO is simply the difference between y hat 4 and the y4, right? So that's something we already know. So DO will be computed, and the DV, according to the backprop principle, it will be DO times A4 transposed, right? So far, we just use the information at time step 4, at the current time step, right? But from the next step on, the DA will be VT times DO4. It's also the regular backprop, okay? But now, since when we compute A4, there are two components, there are two time steps involved, not just the X4, right? But also A3 involved, okay? So let's assume that this is the Z4 here, Okay, so this is the Z4 here. Then the dZ4 would be the dA, right, times the Z4 with this derivative of this activation function. So this is the backprop, right? But now we will have dW and du computed. dW will be this style, and du will be this formula. So these are all regular backprop algorithms, right? So now we have dW and du's. Okay, so the thing with dZ is that the dZ will backprop to dA3, right? You see, so the dZ is the result of W trans A3 times A3. So the A3 will also receive gradients. The gradients for A3 is W transpose dZ4, and the dZ3 can also be computed. So it's like we will need to replicate. We need to do the same text at the previous time step. At the previous time step now. Okay, it's not within the fourth time step, but in the third time step. Okay, and we will have the dW at time step 3 now, and the du at time step 3. So these are different from the dW4 at dW at the fourth time step, right? Right. But they correspond to the same parameter, although they are from different time steps. So we need to collect them eventually. So let's further backprop through time. We will have the dW and du at the second time step and at the first time step. Okay, so all these places that I marked at the same color, actually they need to be collected and combined, because for example, the green one refers to the gradients for the W, right? It's the gradients for W. Since we have backpropped through time, then we need to collect all the gradients in order to compute the gradients, the actual gradients for W. And the gradients for U also consist of 4 time steps from 1, 2, 3 to 4. So eventually we need to compute, we need to sum up all the gradients for each time step and then use that as the actual gradients to update the parameters. So this is a complete example of back propagation through time. Okay. All right. So that's the basic simple neural network structure. I think we can cover this the next few slides also. So it's for the different RNN architectures, right? So the network structure that we have seen here is like for each input, for each time step in the input, we will have a corresponding output, right? So it's basically a many input to many outputs style, right? We'll see in the next slide that there are actually more different style architecture other than this. Okay, so this is the so-called many-to-many, because the outputs for we will have an output for each input time step, right? So this is particularly useful for the named entity recognition and other NLP tasks such as part of speech tagging and so on. So the second type of inputs of architecture is the many-to-one, which means that for the time steps before the final time step, we don't need an output. We will just need the inputs, need the outputs from the previous, from the last output, from the last time step, because the task just requires one output. For example, if it's the sentiment analysis, then we will let the model takes one sentence as input and only collect the time step, only collect the activation from the last time step, and that will be the basis for the prediction, right? So other times, the other architectures includes the one-to-many, which means we will only take one input. So this is a special application because and it's not that common, because like if we're gonna generate language or generate music, then we will need a place to start, right? A place to an input to jumpstart the generation. Like we give an input word, and the model should generate some meaningful output word, right? So, but we need to collect all the outputs at each time step during the output stage, right? And for this particular task, the generation at the first time step will be used as the input for the next time step, right? Because the model requires some inputs as for each time step. So we will keep these previous output as the current inputs. Okay. And the other type is many-to-many, which is a very typical architecture for example, machine translation. When we have two sequences, we will take one sequence as inputs, right? That's the language in the source language, the input in the source language, and we will use the activations from the final time step, and use that as a starting point to generate output for the generation stage, for the decoding stage. Okay, and during the left half, right, we don't need to output the activations, the output for each time step. Okay, so these are unnecessary. All right. So I think we have covered pretty much a lot for the basic recurrent neural network models. And I think I will end the lecture today so that you can take some time to digest the contents so far. And from the next week on, we will carry on with the remaining examples. For example, we'll talk about language model. We'll talk about other complete examples. Okay. So if there's no questions, I will end the recording now.